What if we told you that one of Harlem's most notorious figures was equally feared and beloved, a man who could order ruthless violence one moment and recite poetry the next? Such was the paradox of Ellsworth Raymond, Bumpy Johnson, the so-called godfather of Harlem. For over 30 years, Johnson ruled Harlem's illegal gambling world with an iron fist, yet he also cultivated an image as a protector and patron in his community. He was a crime boss who read philosophy in prison and played chess with mafia dons on 135th Street. This documentary journey explores Bumpy Johnson's life and criminal enterprise with a strict focus on historical reality from his early years in the Jim Crow South, through the heyday of Harlem's numbers racket to his final days as an underworld legend whose death symbolized the end of an era. In a narrative drawn entirely from verifiable records, classical biographies, FBI files, and contemporary newspaper accounts, we present the true story of Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, minus the Hollywood embellishments, as a saga of survival, enterprise, and intrigue in 20th century Harlem. Johnson's story begins far from New York. He was born on October 31st, 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, a time and place where opportunities for a black child were scarce. He earned the nickname Bumpy early on due to a noticeable bump on his head, a minor deformity that stuck as an ironic badge of distinction. His formative years in the segregated South were cut short by violence. When Bumpy was 10 years old, his older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man, and the family feared a lynch mob's vengeance. Desperate to save their children, Bumpy's parents sent most of their 7 kids north to the relative safety of Harlem, which by the 1910s had become a major black enclave amid the Great Migration. Arriving in New York around 1915, a young Ellsworth moved in with his older sister in Harlem and discovered that northern streets held their own dangers and prejudices. His thick southern accent and small stature made him an easy target for neighborhood bullies. But Bumpy refused to remain a victim. He fought back with a fiery temper and quick fists, earning a reputation as a scrappy brawler who was not to be messed with. Those early fistfights on Harlem streets taught him hard lessons about respect and fear, lessons that would define his path in the underworld. Bumpy Johnson's formal education was short-lived. He dropped out of high school in his teens, scratching out a living with odd jobs, shooting pool for cash, selling newspapers, sweeping restaurant storefronts, anything to get by in Harlem's teeming streets. His first break in the underworld came almost by accident. As legend has it, while cleaning outside a shop, he was confronted by William Bub Hewlett, a local gangster who controlled the block. When the teenaged Bumpy boldly refused to back down from Hewlett's corner, the older gangster took a liking to the fearless kid. Impressed by Bumpy's audacity, Hewlett invited him into the rackets, introducing him to the thriving gambling scene in Harlem. Soon the young tough was working as muscle, providing physical protection to high-profile numbers bankers and illegal gamblers around the neighborhood. By his late teens, Bumpy had become one of Harlem's most sought after bodyguards for illicit entrepreneurs, gaining invaluable contacts in the city's clandestine betting parlors. Yet with each step deeper into the underworld, Johnson accumulated a rap sheet. In the 1920s, he graduated from petty hustles to more serious crimes, armed robbery, extortion, even pimping as he strove for a bigger piece of Harlem's illicit profits. Inevitably, the law caught up with him. As a young man, Bumpy cycled in and out of jail and reformatories, unable to avoid punishment for his exploits. Finally, around age 19, he was busted for a burglary and received a significant prison term. He would spend much of his 20s behind bars. According to later accounts, Bumpy served about 7 to 10 years in prison in the 1920s. One stretch was a 2-year sentence for grand larceny that kept him locked up until 1932. By the time he was released, he had spent fully half of his life in custody, gaining an unsought education in the penal system. Johnson's prison stints, however, would become a crucial part of his evolution. During those years in New York's penitentiaries, the wary gangster transformed himself into something of an underground scholar. Fellow inmates gave him the nickname, the Professor, for the way he devoured books behind bars. Bumpy passed the long days reading history, literature, and philosophy, sharpening his mind as much as his fists. He even became a skilled chess player, studying strategy as intently as any grandmaster. This intellectual cultivation set him apart from the average street hoodlum. Over the course of his life, Johnson would log an estimated 26 years in prison in total, and he used every spell of incarceration to educate himself. Every time he went away, he studied every book he could get his hands on. One journalist noted admiringly, the result was a gangster who could quote Nietzsche and Shakespeare, write poetry for Harlem magazines, and hold his own in chess matches against mob bosses, an extraordinary refinement that earned him respect in unexpected quarters. Johnson walked out of prison in 1932 as a 26-year-old with no money, no legitimate job prospects, and a burning determination to seize his share of Harlem's booming underground economy. Fortunately for him, he returned to a neighborhood where one illegal enterprise towered above all others, the numbers game. In early 20th century Harlem, the numbers racket, an informal, daily lottery played for pennies or dollars, was not just a street hustle, but a way of life. It offered hope of a windfall to the poor, steady employment to thousands of black Harlemites, and enormous wealth to the few who ran the banks. By the 1920s, the numbers game had exploded into Harlem's largest black-run business, turning over tens of millions of dollars every year. The game was elegantly simple. For as little as a nickel, players would choose a 3-digit number from 1,000 to 999 and place bets at local taverns, barbershops, newsstands, or even candy stores that quietly acted as betting parlors. Each day, a winning 3-digit number was determined by a random, publicly published figure, often the last digits of the total money wagered at a major horse racetrack or the daily stock exchange balance, a clever trick that ensured the outcome was unpredictable and not rigged by the house. If a player's number hit, the payoff was typically 600 to 1. In other words, a $1 bet could yield 600 tax, free and desperately enticing in those Depression years. The odds of winning were 1 in fun Zalozend, so the banks made a handsome profit even running an honest game. And not all games were honest before the use of independent random numbers. Some racketeers would fix the drawings to avoid popular numbers. But once a trusted system using published financial figures came into place, an innovation credited to a Harlem numbers baron named Caspar Holstein in the 1920s, the betting public flocked to play. By 1931, at least 30 policy banks operated in Harlem, many employing dozens of people to collect bets. Contemporary estimates suggested 100,000 bets were placed daily in Harlem alone by the late 1920s. The largest bankers, dubbed the kings and queens of the numbers racket, reaped fortunes and reigned as folk heroes in the community. At street level, the structure of the numbers operation was a marvel of clandestine organization. Each neighborhood had its army of numbers runners, men and women who fanned out every morning to collect bets and coin from regular players on their route. A runner might hang out at a friendly luncheonette or barbershop, quietly writing down bets in a pocket ledger called a policy book, while customers whispered their lucky numbers for the day. By afternoon, the runners turned in their take to a local controller, the middle manager who oversaw a network of runners in a given territory. The controller verified the tally and handed everything up to the central bank, often nothing more glamorous than a secret office in the back of a basement or candy store. There, the bankers would aggregate all wagers, eliminate any duplicate slips, and await the published winning number. If a hit occurred, the bank paid out the winnings and covered overhead costs like bribes, lawyers, and bail, expenses essential to keeping the racket alive. Everyone in the chain took a cut. Runners typically kept 20-25% of their daily collections as commission. Controllers took around 10%, and the remaining share, roughly 65% of the intake, went to the bank. Out of that, the bank paid the winners at 601 odds and pocketed the rest, usually netting about 10% profit on total wagers in the long run. It was a lucrative system that thrived on trust and community ties. Players needed to believe they'd be paid, and bankers needed police and politicians paid off to operate freely. By the time Bumpy Johnson came home in 1932, Harlem's numbers racket was at a crossroads. The prosperity of the kings and queens had inevitably drawn the attention of outside gangsters looking to horn in. In the late 1920s, a few white mobsters from downtown, enriched by prohibition bootlegging, started eyeing Harlem's betting action. The most aggressive was Arthur Dutch Schultz Flegenheimer, a brutal Bronx-born gangster of Jewish-Irish origin who had earned the nickname Beer Baron of the Bronx, running speakeasies. Schultz and his thugs saw the Harlem policy bankers as easy prey, independent black operators whom they could shake down or eliminate to seize control of the richest numbers territory in America. By 1931, ominous cracks had appeared in the black gamblers' dominance. Schultz began dispatching his goons uptown to establish rival betting offices and persuade existing bankers to pay tribute or face consequences. At first, the incursion was subtle. Before long, it turned violent. Into this volatile scene stepped Stephanie St. Clair, the woman who would change Bumpy Johnson's life. Madame St. Clair, known as the Queen of the Policy Rackets, was a Caribbean-born immigrant who had built one of Harlem's top numbers operations in the 1920s. Fluent in French and armed with an aristocratic air, she was as savvy and mercurial as they come. Arrogant, sophisticated, and educated, with a blistering temper for anyone who crossed her. By 1930, St. Clair and her chief lieutenant, another black gambler named Casper Holstein, were raking in profits from the flourishing numbers trade, but the rise of Schultz and his violent campaign to wrest away Harlem's gambling dollars put her kingdom under dire threat. St. Clair responded with defiance both legally and illegally. She lodged complaints with the city, testifying to an investigative commission. About police corruption aiding the hoodlums, her testimony even got some crooked cops dismissed. At the same time, she quietly armed her crew for guerrilla war. When Bumpy Johnson was released from prison in 1932, broke and hungry, he gravitated back to Harlem's only viable economic sector for a black man with his skill set, the rackets. He soon crossed paths with Madame St. Clair. Accounts vary on their first meeting. Some say Bumpy sought her out for a job, others that St. Clair had heard of this fearless young enforcer fresh out of prison. In any event, the tough, talking queen of Harlem's numbers saw potential in Johnson. She was impressed by his intellect and nerve, and despite being nearly 20 years his senior, she took Bumpy under her wing as her bodyguard, enforcer, and protégé. The two became fast friends and partners in crime. Years later, Johnson's wife Mamie wrote that St. Clair was drawn to Bumpy's combination of brains and brawn. He was intelligent, she noted, and utterly loyal. In the dark days of 1932-33, as Dutch Schultz's shadow loomed, Bumpy became the tip of St. Clair's spear. The conflict that followed has gone down in Harlem lore as the Numbers War. On one side, the diminutive 5'7" Dodgered Bumpy Johnson and a handful of black enforcers defending their home turf. On the other, Dutch Schultz as well, armed gangsters, backed by the deeper resources of downtown organized crime. The violence was shocking and relentless. The corpses were piling up in Harlem, wrote one chronicler, noting that at least 40 people were slain in gun battles and assassinations during this period. Bumpy and his crew of 9 men waged what Mamie Johnson described as a guerrilla war against the invaders. They knew every alley and rooftop in Harlem, allowing them to mount surprise attacks. And picking off Schultz's lackeys was made easier by their conspicuousness, as Mamie quipped. There were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day, so Bumpy's boys could spot their targets readily. Drive-by shootings, kidnappings, knifings, the campaign was ruthless. By war's end, some 40 of Dutch Schultz's henchmen had been kidnapped or killed on Harlem streets for trying to muscle in. Johnson himself was reputed to have personally murdered or disposed of over 40 people during these years as St. Clair's chief enforcer. It was as if the quiet young man who had once swept sidewalks had become a one-man army, exacting a deadly toll on intruders. One particularly gruesome incident still illustrates Bumpy Johnson's lethal reputation. A Harlem racketeer named Ulysses Rollins had dared to rival Bumpy in the mid-1930s. The two men's feud came to a head at a local nightclub. According to contemporary accounts, Bumpy pounced on Rollins with a switchblade and engaged him in a brief but ferocious fight. When the dust settled, witnesses were horrified to see that Johnson had stabbed Rollins 36 times, carving him up so badly that one of Rollins's eyeballs was left dangling from its socket by a thread. The room fell silent as the mortally wounded Rollins collapsed. Bumpy, unfazed, calmly straightened his tie, stepped over the bloodied body, picked up a dinner menu, and announced with chilling nonchalance that he suddenly had a craving for spaghetti and meatballs. The story has become part of Johnson's legend, exemplifying the almost theatrical bravado with which he meted out punishment. And yet, even this brutality was directed with purpose. It sent a message that no challenge to Bumpy's authority would go unanswered. Rollins, like so many others, had earned his wrath and paid the price. Such was the fear Johnson instilled that for the rest of his life, few dared cross him in Harlem. Despite the valiant fight put up by St. Clair, Johnson, and their allies, the numbers war did not end in clear victory for the locals. Dutch Schultz had advantages that were difficult to overcome. Most importantly, he had police officials on his payroll, thanks to years of buying off cops during Prohibition. While Harlem's bankers struggled to find protection, Schultz could call on friendly officers to raid St. Clair's operations and shield his own. St. Clair simply did not have the contacts with the police to protect her turf. One history notes bluntly, even as bodies dropped in the streets, many in authority turned a blind eye to Schultz's aggression or even abetted it. Facing this onslaught, Madame St. Clair's empire steadily shrank. By mid-1935, she was cornered and began contemplating an exit from the business. The stress was immense. Her common-law husband had betrayed her, and she narrowly avoided prison in a related shooting scandal, further weakening her position. Realizing that Schultz, as backed by the larger Italian Mafia, was too powerful to resist indefinitely, St. Clair made a fateful decision. She agreed to surrender control of her numbers empire. In essence, the independent era of Harlem's numbers kings and queens was coming to an end. It was at this critical juncture that destiny took an unexpected turn. Dutch Schultz, flush with his Harlem gains, overreached by planning a hit on crusading New York prosecutor Thomas Dewey, a move the Mafia hire, upsteamed reckless and bad for business. Charles, Lucky, Luciano, the rising boss of bosses in New York's underworld, decided to eliminate Schultz rather than risk the wrath of law enforcement. On October 25, 1935, Schultz was gunned down by Mafia hitmen in a Newark tavern, ending his reign for good. In his delirium before dying, the story goes, Dutch received a telegram in the hospital from an unrepentant Stephanie St. Clair, quoting the Bible. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. Schultz's removal suddenly changed the balance of power in Harlem. With the notorious thug out of the picture, Lucky Luciano saw an opportunity to make peace uptown and profit from it. Luciano reached out to the one man left standing who could command Harlem's gambling operations, Bumpy Johnson. Dutch Schultz's 1930s mugshot. Schultz's attempted takeover of Harlem's numbers racket led to a bloody turf war, until his 1935 murder at the hands of fellow mobsters ended his campaign. In the wake of Schultz's assassination, a remarkable deal was struck. Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano, who had been bitter enemies during the numbers war, sat down and negotiated a mutual alliance. Under the terms of their truce, the Italian Mafia agreed to let Harlem's numbers banks remain under black control, with Bumpy Johnson overseeing their operations as the de facto boss. In return, Johnson would funnel a cut of the profits to Luciano's crime family, later known as the Genovese family, as a form of tribute. It was an unprecedented arrangement. For the first time, a black gangster had effectively stood up to the white mob and negotiated a peace with honor, instead of being steamrolled. Many Harlemites, wary of the violence, saw Bumpy's deal as a pragmatic victory. As Mamie Johnson wrote, the people of Harlem realized Bumpy had ended the war with no further losses and had negotiated a peace with honor. They realized that for the first time a black man had stood up to the white mob instead of just bowing down. Bumpy's personal standing in the community skyrocketed. He was now more than just an enforcer. He was the guardian of Harlem's last great homegrown enterprise. The Luciano-Johnson Pact in 1935 effectively made Bumpy the godfather of Harlem. With Stephanie St. Clair stepping aside, she would later retire from crime and live quietly under Bumpy's protection until her death in 1969. Johnson took the helm of the uptown gambling racket. Of course, the Italian mob still expected its share, but day to day Bumpy had autonomy on his turf. From the late 1930s onward, virtually anything illegal that happened in Harlem required Bumpy Johnson's blessing. If you wanted to do anything in Harlem, anything at all, you'd better stop and see Bumpy because he ran the place, Mamie Johnson recalled. Numbers running, bootlegging, small casinos in back rooms, even who could open a bar or a spot on the avenue, all of it had to be cleared with Mr. Johnson. Those who defied him found out quickly that Harlem was no longer open territory. Hoodlums who tried to set up independent gambling rings or encroach on his domain were taught harsh lessons, much like Ulysses Rowland's had been. Johnson's sway was reinforced by his unique position as a liaison between the Italian mob and Harlem's black underworld. He regularly met with top mafia bosses. Most famously, he would meet Lucky Luciano for chess games at the YMCA on 135th Street, where the two men from utterly different backgrounds found common ground over strategy and respect. The image is almost cinematic: a Natalie dressed Bumpy and the suave Luciano calmly moving rooks and knights on a public sidewalk board, while gunmen on both sides stood guard nearby. That these meetings even occurred speaks to the level of esteem Bumpy had earned. Luciano and his successors, like Chin, gigant of the Genovese family, in later years viewed Johnson as a valuable partner, a man of honor who kept order in Harlem and profits rolling in. It was exceedingly rare for a black gangster of that era to achieve such parity in dealings with the Mafia. With his power secure and the bloody turf wars over, Bumpy Johnson settled into his role as Harlem's undisputed boss. He was around 30 years old at the end of the 1930s, entering what should have been the prime of his criminal career. And indeed, the decades to come, the 1940s and 1950s, would see Johnson both cement his legend and face some of his greatest challenges. During this period, his persona in the community blossomed into a mix of fear and admiration. On the streets he was often respectfully called Mr. Johnson, or simply Bumpy, and many also dubbed him the Harlem Robin Hood, for his habit of redistributing some wealth to those in need. Under Bumpy's reign, the numbers racket continued to thrive. He managed the enterprise efficiently, keeping the Italian cutters satisfied while ensuring local runners and controllers got their piece. According to underworld lore, if a new numbers spot or a speakeasy wanted to open in Harlem, the proprietor would visit Bumpy first to get approval as, and likely agree on a kickback. Johnson thus acted as a gatekeeper, preventing turf disputes and maintaining a semblance of order in the underworld economy. The arrangement also meant he could quietly enforce rules against more destructive crimes in his neighborhood. For example, during the 1940s, Bumpy was said to discourage the open sale of heroin in Harlem, a stance that would become significant later. His relationships with authority were complex. While he had an alliance with the Mafia, Bumpy still had to deal with law enforcement scrutiny. At times, he could rely on the Mafia's corrupt police contacts to keep the heat off his operations. The Italians had long greased the NYPD to protect their interests, and those same officers often turned a blind eye to Bumpy's bankers or targeted his few remaining rivals as part of the profit-sharing understanding. However, not all cops were in the mob's pocket, and Johnson himself was never beyond the law's reach. Throughout the late 30s and 40s, he was arrested numerous times on charges ranging from assault, illegal gambling, narcotics, and vagrancy. Many arrests were short-term hassles that never led to major convictions. He had top lawyers on retainer, paid from the Numbers Bank Fund, to beat cases or appeal them. Still, by one count, Bumpy accumulated over 40 arrests in his lifetime, a testament to constant surveillance by authorities. The NYPD and FBI both kept files on Johnson as a key figure in the Harlem underworld, trailing him in unmarked cars and tapping phones in hopes of pinning something on him. This perpetual cat and mouse game with the law would eventually come to a head in dramatic fashion. Beyond the business and the violence, Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson cultivated a surprising personal life that made him a celebrity of sorts in Harlem's high society. He had a flair for style, often seen about town in dapper three-piece suits, silk shirts, and finely polished shoes. With his intelligence and charm, he mingled easily with Harlem's elite. He was known to rub elbows with entertainers like jazzy crooner Billie Holiday and boxing champion Sugar Ray Robinson. At swanky clubs and restaurants, Bumpy carried himself with quiet confidence and impeccable manners. He wasn't a typical gangster. Observed one admirer, none other than the future drug lord Frank Lucas. He worked in the streets, but he wasn't of the streets. He was refined and classy, more like a businessman than most people in the underworld. Indeed, Johnson stood out from other hoodlums by his love of culture. He wrote poetry. Some of his poems were even published in local Harlem magazines. He enjoyed reading literature and could discuss everything from James Weldon Johnson's latest novel to French philosophy. He had a weakness for challenging others to chess matches in Satan. Nicholas Park, reportedly delighting in outwitting talented players. There are legends that he even played against Grandmaster Bobby Fischer as a boy in the 1950s, though such stories are hard to verify. Bumpy's intellectual reputation became such that in some circles he was fondly called the Professor, hearkening back to his prison-honed erudition. Women were another facet of Johnson's life that added to his mystique. In 1948, Bumpy married a glamorous young woman named Mamie Hatcher, who had come up from North Carolina and captured his heart shortly after his release from a 10-year prison stint. Mamie would remain his devoted companion and later chronicler. There's her memoir Harlem Godfather offers invaluable first-hand insight. But Bumpy's charisma attracted many admirers, and he wasn't strictly monogamous. He was rumored to have had affairs with notable women, including socialites and even celebrities. For instance, one account claims he had a romance with Helen Lawrenson, a prominent editor at Vanity Fair, and also a dalliance with the stunning singer, actress Lena Horne. True or not, such tales fed the image of Bumpy Johnson as a sort of urbane rogue, a gangster who could discuss fine literature over cocktails with a New York editor one evening, and then, the next morning, order his thugs to break a rival's legs for missing a payment. It's no wonder that many in Harlem viewed him with a mix of awe, fear, and respect. Johnson also gave back to the community in ways that furthered his Robin Hood legend. During the holidays, he made a point of sharing his wealth with those struggling. He famously funded an annual Thanksgiving turkey giveaway, delivering free turkeys to impoverished families so that everyone could enjoy a feast. At Christmas, he would host lavish parties and hand out gifts and meals to needy neighbors. Throughout the year, if a family fell on hard times or someone needed bail money, it was often Bumpy who quietly footed the bill. Elderly folks in Harlem knew they could come to Mr. Johnson if they couldn't pay the rent, and he'd help rather than see them evicted. Such acts earned him genuine love from portions of the community, even as others disapproved of his criminal ways. One contemporary recalled that Bumpy would lecture young people on the street to stay in school and avoid the life of crime, though always with a twinkle of humor about his own situation. He would say things like, "Learn your algebra and history, because I sure spent a lot of time studying mine in the pen," making light of his prison learning while encouraging youths to take a better path. Of course, some of those teenagers ended up working for him anyway, but the point was not lost. Bumpy Johnson, for all his vice, cared about Harlem's future. Perhaps one of the most telling anecdotes of Bumpy's community role comes from legendary journalist Jimmy Breslin. Breslin knew Johnson well and once asked a favor. Breslin's younger sister had gotten a job as a schoolteacher in Harlem in the mid-1960s, and Jimmy worried for her safety in the rough neighborhood. He called up Bumpy and requested that he keep an eye on her. Johnson happily obliged. Not long after, Breslin's sister reported back with an amusing story her students were unbelievably well behaved, bringing her apples each morning like little angels. Unbeknownst to her, Bumpy had arranged for his men to give the local kids apples to present to teacher and instructed them all to mind their manners in her class. The teacher even met a polite older gentleman named Ellsworth, who dropped by the school to introduce himself as a friend of her brother and to assure her she would be safe. She recalled that this kindly man joked that he worked for the federal government for many years. Only later did Breslin explain that meant he'd been in federal prisons for much of his life. Thanks to Bumpy's quiet protection, Breslin's sister became the safest person in Harlem, able to walk home without fear even in the dead of night. Such stories illustrate the clout Johnson wielded. His very word deterred any would-be trouble harming someone under Bumpy's wing was simply unthinkable on those streets. Despite Johnson's local goodwill and mafia alliances, eventually law enforcement caught up with him in a serious way. Through the 1940s, he had largely avoided major prison time, but by the early 1950s, the federal government, newly empowered by stringent narcotics laws, turned its gaze to Harlem's crime figures. It wasn't gambling that tripped Bumpy up, it was drugs. In 1951, Johnson was indicted in a federal drug conspiracy case, accused of conspiring to distribute heroin in New York. Johnson vehemently denied he was a heroin dealer, claiming he'd been framed, and indeed, some Harlem old-timers believe Bumpy had tried to keep heroin out, not push it in. Nevertheless, in October 1952, the hammer fell. Ellsworth, Bumpy. Johnson was convicted in federal court and sentenced to 15 years in prison. It was the harshest punishment of his career and a devastating blow to his empire. At age 47, Bumpy was shipped off to Alcatraz, the infamous island penitentiary in San Francisco Bay, to serve hard time far from home. His removal left a vacuum in Harlem's underworld, one that others, including some of his own proteges, would soon scramble to fill with less restraint than he had exercised. Johnson's years at Alcatraz 1954-1963 added new chapters to his legend. Even behind the prison's cold stone walls, his name carried weight. In June 1962, Alcatraz was rocked by the daring escape of inmates Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin, the only presumed successful escape in the penitentiary's history. Whispers around the yard suggested that Bumpy Johnson might have had a hand in this sensational breakout. Rumor had it that Bumpy used his secret underworld connections to arrange for a boat to pick up the escapees once they reached the bay. An specially impressive feat, given Alcatraz's reputation as escape-proof. There is no hard evidence to confirm Johnson's involvement, and the FBI has never verified such claims. But the mere fact that fellow inmates and guards believed Bumpy capable of engineering an escape speaks to the influence he wielded even in custody. As his wife later theorized, Bumpy himself had no interest in escaping. He desired to be a free man rather than a fugitive, Mamie said. Indeed, Johnson was nearing parole by then and wouldn't jeopardize it. If anything, he may have quietly assisted others out of a sense of mischief or solidarity. But he stayed put, knowing his day of freedom would come the right way. Life in Alcatraz for Bumpy Johnson was undoubtedly tough, but he endured by leaning on the same qualities that had defined him: brains and discipline. Inmates recall him as calm and resolute, a prisoner who avoided needless trouble. He worked a prison job in the brush shop and kept to a routine. Perhaps remembering how his earlier prison stints had educated him, Bumpy spent much of his time in Alcatraz's library, reading voraciously. By the time he left, guards were calling him the Professor for his studious habits. Notably, Johnson was incarcerated at Alcatraz during the exact years when heroin flooded Harlem in the late 50s and early 60s, a tragic boom he might have opposed had he been free. He could only watch from afar as his beloved neighborhood deteriorated from the drug scourge. In March 1963, after serving about 9 years of his sentence, Ellsworth Johnson was released from prison just months before Alcatraz prison itself was closed and emptied. At 57, Bumpy stepped back onto the streets of New York a changed man, at least on the surface. He vowed that he was done with the gangster life. To prove it, he opened a legitimate front business, the Palmetto Exterminating Company on 2nd Avenue, offering pest control services. He settled into a new apartment with his wife Mamie, whom he had married in 1948 before his conviction, and doted on his 2 daughters, one of whom, Ruthie, was Mamie's from a previous relationship, and another, Margaret, was actually Bumpy's granddaughter, whom he raised as his own child. Harlem, for its part, welcomed back its folk hero in grand style. When Bumpy returned home in '63, locals organized an impromptu parade in his honor. Crowds lined the streets, cheering and waving, as the King of Harlem rode through once more. It was as if a triumphant fighter had come home. The neighborhood had missed the man who had been both protector and provider. But Harlem in the 1960s was not the same place Bumpy had left a decade earlier. The once glittering nightlife district had fallen into physical and social disrepair. Urban decay was setting in. More ominously, heroin had swept through the community like a plague, leaving addiction, crime, and despair in its wake. Much of this influx of drugs was thanks to the very Italian mobsters with whom Johnson had once brokered peace. In Bumpy's absence, the Mafia had taken advantage of Harlem's open market to push vast quantities of narcotics, reaping huge profits at the expense of the neighborhood's health. The sight distressed Bumpy. He saw young men he once knew as hustlers now strung out on dope, street corners that had bustled with music now haunted by desperate junkies. According to Mamie, Bumpy truly wanted to help Harlem recover and advocate for its black citizens. But how could a career criminal step into the role of community savior? The times were changing, and new leaders were emerging to address Harlem's woes. One such figure was Bumpy's old acquaintance Malcolm X. The fiery minister and activist had been a small-time hustler known as Detroit Red. Back in the 1940s, indeed, Malcolm knew Bumpy from those days and respected him. By 1964, Malcolm X had broken away from the Nation of Islam and become a prominent and heavily threatened voice for black empowerment in Harlem. According to multiple accounts, in the weeks after Bumpy's return from prison, Malcolm X quietly sought out his childhood friend for help. With enemies baying for his blood, Malcolm asked Bumpy Johnson to provide protection for him in Harlem, and Bumpy agreed. He discreetly assigned some of his best men to guard Malcolm during public appearances, reportedly armed with shotguns under their coats. It was a striking alliance, the minister preaching racial dignity, and the gangster enforcing a street code of honor. For Malcolm, however, the optics were problematic. After some reflection, he told Bumpy he had to refuse the underworld help. It was not good for his image to be openly associated with a figure like Johnson. Bumpy understood and withdrew his guards. Tragically, just 2 weeks later, in February 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated while speaking at the Audubon Ballroom. Gunned down by rivals from the Nation of Islam, Bumpy took the news hard. He respected Malcolm immensely. Some later mused whether things might have gone differently had Bumpy's men been there that day. Regardless, the episode underlined a hard truth. The community's troubles in the 1960s were beyond even Bumpy Johnson's power to solve. Bumpy did not retreat quietly into civilian life. By the mid-60s, he was edging back into his old habits, frustrated by constant police harassment despite his outwardly legitimate front. In December 1965, in a show of defiance, Johnson staged a one-man protest that became front-page news. Fed up with relentless surveillance, he walked into the 28th Precinct Police Station on the 123rd Street and sat down, refusing to leave. Day after day, officers had been tailing him everywhere he went, even to the grocery store, hoping to catch him in wrongdoing. Now Johnson turned the tables, essentially saying, "If you're going to watch me, you can do it while I sit right here in your office." For hours he sat impassively at the station, a quiet challenge in his eyes. Flustered police eventually arrested him for trespassing that he was charged with, refusing to leave the station. The incident garnered attention, and at trial Bumpy was acquitted, making the NYPD look rather foolish. This brazen sit-in at a police station symbolized Johnson's ongoing war with law enforcement. They saw him as an incorrigible criminal. He viewed himself as a businessman hounded by racially biased authorities who never gave black entrepreneurs, even illegal ones, a fair shake. Yet even as he sparred with local police, the feds were still on his case. In 1967, federal agents in unmarked cars began tailing Johnson around the city, suspecting he was back in the narcotics game. One afternoon, Bumpy noticed a car following him through Harlem. Instead of trying to hide, he hit the gas, leading the agents on a wild high-speed car chase through Manhattan streets and into Queens. The pursuit ended on the Van Wyck Expressway, where federal officers pulled him over and arrested him after a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Though they found no drugs in the vehicle, a grand jury still handed down a new indictment for drug conspiracy based on informer testimony. It seemed the government was determined to put Bumpy away again. Johnson posted a hefty $50,000 bail and vowed to fight the charges, maintaining his innocence as he always had. But fate intervened before the case could go to trial. In the early hours of July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson's remarkable life came to an end in the most mundane of ways. Just after 2 a.m., Johnson was sitting in Wells Restaurant, a favorite Harlem eatery on Lenox Avenue famed for its fried chicken and waffles. He was in good spirits, laughing with old friends over a late meal of soul food, fried chicken, collard greens, coffee. Suddenly, in mid-conversation, Ellsworth grimaced and fell silent, slumping to the floor. He had suffered a massive heart attack. Panicked friends cradled him as he lost consciousness. One of his closest companions, Junie Bird, a childhood friend from Charleston days, held Bumpy in his arms as he lay on the tile floor of Wells' dining room. Within moments, Harlem's godfather was gone, dead at age 62. It was said that as he died, Bumpy had money in his pocket and friends at his side, perhaps small consolations for a violent life ending in peace. News of Johnson's death sent shockwaves through Harlem. Many were stunned that he had died so quietly, not in a bloody shootout or under a gangland assassin's bullet, but from natural causes while enjoying comfort food. Some were simply surprised that it had not been a violent demise. Mamie later wrote, "In a way, the manner of his passing seemed almost poetic. Bumpy's life may have been violent and turbulent, but his death was one that any Harlem sporting man would pray for, eating fried chicken at Wells' restaurant in the wee hours, surrounded by childhood friends." It just can't get better than that, Mamie reflected. When Johnson was laid to rest, Harlem sent him off in a fashion befitting a folk hero. Thousands of people attended his funeral, crowding the streets near the funeral home. Old-timers, numbers runners, housewives, and teenagers, people from all walks of life, came to pay respects. Scores of uniformed NYPD officers were also on the scene, but notably not to honor him, they perched atop surrounding rooftops with shotguns, nervously watching the proceedings in case violence erupted. They must have thought Bumpy was going to get up from the casket and start raising hell. Mamie observed wryly about the heavy police presence. The services themselves were dignified. The eulogy was delivered by Rev. John J. Johnson, no relation, who noted Bumpy's complex legacy, praising his loyalty and generosity while lamenting the path society had forced him down. He was not a coward, and he never betrayed a friend. The minister said, maybe there was no other way for him to be a man. As the final prayers were read, many in the crowd openly wept. With Bumpy's passing, an era truly ended. The local Amsterdam news ran a headline capturing the sentiment, Bumpy de Marques end of anera. In the aftermath, control of Harlem's rackets shifted, and not for the better. Johnson's absence left a power vacuum that younger, more reckless criminals rushed to fill. Chief among them was Frank Lucas, a former driver and errand runner for Bumpy, who now saw himself as heir apparent. Lucas would later claim that he had been Bumpy's right-hand man and that Johnson died in my arms that night at Wells. In truth, by many accounts including Mamie's, Lucas was not nearly as close to Bumpy as he boasted. They had even had a falling out before Bumpy went to prison, and Lucas was certainly not present at his death. Nevertheless, with Bumpy gone, Frank Lucas forged his own empire in the late 1960s by flooding Harlem with heroin on an unprecedented scale. He organized major drug imports from Southeast Asia, the infamous Golden Triangle pipeline, and made millions, but at a horrific cost to the community. The Harlem that Bumpy had carefully controlled and somewhat sheltered was now awash in narcotics, and the violence and decay only intensified. Ironically, some of the Italian mobsters who once partnered with Bumpy also contributed to this downturn, as they too jumped headlong into the drug trade. The relatively policed vice economy of policy gambling and drinking that existed under Bumpy gave way to the far more destructive economy of heroin, which ravaged Harlem through the 1970s. Still, Johnson's legacy endured in more positive ways. To many Harlemites of the older generation, Bumpy remained a symbol of black resilience and ingenuity, a man who had carved out power and respect under an oppressive system that gave black people few chances. He decided early in life not to be a clown, a flunky, or a beggar, as Rev. Johnson said at the funeral. Bumpy had stood tall against the white mobsters and bent the system, however briefly, in favor of his community. In the years immediately after his death, his name was often invoked nostalgically. During the early 1970s, as New York State moved to legalize a government-run lottery to stamp out the remnants of the numbers racket, some black Harlem leaders resisted by pointing to the era of Bumpy and Madame Cestain. Claire, They argued that the illegal numbers game had been a rare source of economic empowerment for black residents, the biggest black-run business in Harlem, and the biggest employer, as one historian noted. Indeed, even in its decline in the 60s, the numbers industry still employed an estimated 20,000 New Yorkers, many of them black and otherwise jobless. When the state lottery launched in 1967 to replace policy gambling, activists like James R. Lawson protested, insisting that if there was to be legal gambling, the community should run it come hell or high water. But the tide of history was against them. By the early 1980s, illegal numbers running had largely died out, unable to compete with state lotteries and subject to intensified police crackdowns. The colorful era of the policy kings and queens was truly over, consigned to memory, with Bumpy Johnson remembered as one of its most storied figures. For decades, Bumpy's fame remained largely local. Unlike Al Capone or Lucky Luciano, his name wasn't widely known in mainstream America, perhaps because, as some have suggested, the accomplishments of a black crime boss did not receive the same national attention or Hollywood glamorization. However, within the black community and among crime historians, Bumpy was always an object of fascination. In the 1970s and 80s, a few books and magazine articles recounted his exploits, and he began to appear as a character in films about Harlem's past. An elderly Lawrence Fishburne portrayed a Johnson-inspired figure in Francis Ford Coppola's The Cotton Club, 1984, and Fishburne later played Bumpy himself in Hoodlum, 1997, though that film took considerable liberties with facts. A young Clarence Williams III briefly depicted Bumpy Johnson in the opening of the hit movie American Gangster, 2007, which focused on Frank Lucas. Bumpy's widow, Mamie, heavily criticized American Gangster for its inaccuracies, especially its inflated portrayal of Frank Lucas. Lucas was not Bumpy's driver for more than a decade, and he was not present when Bumpy died, she pointed out, correcting the movie's fictions. Mamie Johnson, who passed away in 2009, dedicated her later years to preserving her husband's true story and legacy, co-authoring the biography Harlem Godfather, The Rap on My Husband, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson in 2008. In recent years, Bumpy Johnson's name has resurfaced in popular culture through television. The 2019 series Godfather of Harlem, starring Forrest Whitaker as Johnson, brought a highly dramatized version of his post-prison years to a new audience. Yet, even as these fictionalized accounts play with the story, the real historical Bumpy remains an iconic figure in Harlem history, a man who in the mid-20th century defied the odds to become the most powerful black gangster in New York City. His life encapsulates the complexities of the black urban experience, the entrepreneurial spirit thwarted by racism, the community leadership earned through unlawful means, the line between criminal and folk hero constantly blurred. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson's story is ultimately a Harlem story. It's the tale of a poor kid from the Jim Crow South who found in Harlem not just a refuge, but a stage on which to assert his dignity and power in a world rigged against him. Through cunning, courage, and not a little ruthlessness, he rose to rule an underground empire, all while never losing the affection of the neighbors he quietly helped. His criminal deeds were many, and we do not sugarcoat them, but they exist alongside accounts of generosity and protection that made him larger than life. Even the NYPD officer who dismissed him as a hoodva thug at his funeral had to acknowledge Bumpy's code, if not his choices. In the final measure, Bumpy Johnson lived and died by that code. He once quipped that he had worked for the federal government, in prison far too long, and that in his own way he had also served his community. Harlem, in turn, has never forgotten Bumpy. His name still evokes a bygone era of swing music and zoot suits, of uptown nights when the numbers runners carried dreams in their pocket slips, and a tough yet debonair man named Bumpy ensured that Harlem's game remained in Harlem's hands.